to set the scene, I mean, I don't know how many people have heard of Lowry. I guess Raquel, you're probably the
Yeah,
most likely one to know,
yeah,
as you're probably a mile or
yeah.
two away from where he was.
Salford. Yeah, yeah.
Extraordinary. He's seen as a modern artist, but was born in 1887, the same year as Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. So he gets born as a Victorian, but he becomes a modern painter straight away. And I think most of you would be familiar with him as a painter of the industrial scene, so grey skies and chimneys and mills and factories in Manchester. But there was a whole other side to him. He never married, he never smoked, he never drank. He might have drunk energy drinks, I don't really know, but he never drank alcohol. And he was devoted to painting and drawing throughout his life. But like a lot of people at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, he had to work. So he left school at 16 and worked with his father in a factory office, first of all, in Manchester, and then for a life assurance company for part of his life, and then as a rent collector. So lots of different things. But he had a real sort of love for the sea. So I'm just trying to give you, with some images and a bit of talking, some idea of how he came to be so besotted with the sea and the seaside and people at the seaside.
Yeah,
So
what sparked that interest, Jonathan? If he was in Manchester, what sparked the interest in the sea?
It was not really him, it was his mother. His mother was one of three sisters, and her sister Mary had three beautiful daughters. And unfortunately for Elizabeth, Lowry's mother, she gave birth to one giant 6-foot-plus son eventually, who she dressed as a little girl for about 2 or 3 years, but then that got rather tricky as he grew even more. So somehow Mrs. Lowry's mother's life was full of slight disappointments one way or the other, but the one place where she was happy was the seaside, and particularly Lytham, not Blackpool, which is quite nearby, because she thought that wasn't really very posh, but Lytham was her favourite place. So the place where Lowry and his mother, and sometimes his father, were happiest was the seaside. So it provided some happiness and calm and enjoyment, and also a source of subject matter. So we could perhaps show the first image, which to some extent is self-explanatory. So this is a drawing. This is rather sweet, but it's not at all what you might associate with Lowry, except for one or two key features. This was drawn in 1908, so when Lowry is 21 or 20. And it's, I looked at the date online, it's 17th of May 09, which was a Sunday, and it was during the Whit Week holidays, which were quite common in the north, and all the factories were shut down. So he's gone off for the day with his mother, and it looks like any old landscape. But when you look at the sea, the horizon, you can just see these funny little boats on the horizon, and in the foreground, wind breaks, and there is one brave soul in the water there. It doesn't look a nice day. But here you've just got the very first beginnings of Lowry depicting ships on the sea and figures on the beach, which he goes on to do far more, as we'll see later. But this is the beginning, if you like, and he's getting private lessons at this point, and then goes to college in Manchester to learn his craft a bit more. But this is both interesting but not particularly valuable drawing, and it's about the size of a postcard, so it's quite tiny. Steve, perhaps we go on to the next one. So here is a fully finished oil painting, probably about 1920, so about 10 or 12 years after the drawing that we just looked at. And this is almost certainly Lytham. And it looks like, from Lowry's records and diaries and notes, that he's going to Lytham perhaps once or twice a year, always with his mother. And a picture like this, which is typical in terms of having all the ships in the harbour, but no figures. I think all of us would associate Lowry with lots and lots of figures, pictures like going to the match with rows of people coming out of a football ground. But here it's mostly focused on the ships. And this picture, having been painted in something like 1920, 21, literally disappeared. It was in all the books, but no one knew where it was until it came up for auction just this year. Amazingly, it had belonged to the same family, passed through various generations, and came up at Bonhams in London. And it was expected to make in between 80 and 120,000, but finally, when the hammer fell, it made 230,000, which is a remarkable sum for a slightly untypical picture. It's about in inches, 20 by 24 inches, so not huge.
Is that the most expensive of his seascapes to have sold?
No, indeed, it's, although it's still quite expensive, it's towards the sort of low end. And we'll see a bit later on, there's some almost completely empty seascapes, and they can make at this sort of size in between 600,000 and 800,000, sometimes even $1 million. But the most expensive one made just under 2.4 million in 2022, and that was a 30 by 50 inch canvas. That's almost as big as they get, so very much a trophy piece.
Wow.
But you know, it's surprising. You're looking at something which is untypical, but they're still very sought after. Should we move on to the next image? I mentioned early on how what made Lowry's mother happy also made Lowry happy, and after a long time, Mrs. Lowry finally confessed as to what and where made her happy. So what was going to Lytham, and the other thing was pictures of Lytham. And throughout Lowry's painting life, he was always, perhaps like a lot of us, looking for approval. And if you're a painter, you're putting yourself out there in terms of what you're painting, what you're making. And this, and only this, considering that Lowry painted a considerable number of pictures, perhaps over 3,000 in total, this was the only one that his mother said that she liked and would like to keep. So this was a picture which remained in Lowry's home until 1939, when his mother died, and then he took it to his new house in Mottram. So this was his mother's favourite picture, and probably value-wise is about the same as the one we last saw, and at least it has some figures just in the foreground, bottom right, and you can just see in the background a little, I don't know what you'd call it, really, like a bandstand, a tiny bandstand. Yeah. And there's a beach as well, although it's rather distant, but we'll see another picture later on which gives us a bit of a more flavour of what Lytham was like. Should we go again, Steve? Let's go to the next one. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Lowry, this perhaps is the most Lowry-ish one so far. It's a beach scene, probably again Lytham. And this picture belonged to a man, another painter, a friend of Lowry's, called David Carr. I guess you've all heard of Carr's water table biscuits. This is the same family. There's a tradition in the 19th and early 20th century of Carrs who made biscuits, Huntley and Palmers who made biscuits, and Cross and Blackwell who made biscuits and beans and everything else. For some extraordinary reason, all of those families, who made an enormous amount of money at the time, were great benefactors of art, but two of them, Carr and Palmer, from Huntley and Palmers, were great collectors of Lowry. So this belonged to David Carr. And the reason for owning it was because he liked the way that this was clearly a very hot day by the seaside, but absolutely everybody has still got their clothes on. I think if you look, you can see right at the back, all the men have even still got their hats on, except for one or two in the foreground. But it seemed like a day at the seaside, perhaps for you and I these days, would be at least getting our trunks on, but not in the 1930s when this was painted. I think the only one sunbathing is a man right in the middle with his hat on his tummy, and there's two kids poking him or whatever they're doing. But otherwise, everyone is just sort of milling around as if they would be in the shot. Thanks, Steve. There's the chap. He's sunbathing with his stick by his side, his hat on his tummy, and he's flat out. So that's about as good as it gets.
That's brilliant.
Right, let's move on. There's a lot of mysteries about Lowry, and a lot of it is pretty clear, but this is a drawing probably about 1922, so roughly the same time as the Lytham picture that I mentioned made 230,000. This is an early drawing, and I don't know, can you make it a bit bigger, Steve, or at least go in, say, to the middle of it? Oh, that's perfect, thank you. Now, what you're looking at here looks like a group of people, but basically they're all the same people. They're all versions of Lowry himself. So they're just a whole sheet of studies, if you like. They're self-portraits, Lowry himself in various different hats and guises. And then you see dead center, slightly to the right, a girl facing away from us with a very long plait. And that girl you see again to the right of her with a hat on and a long plait. If you start to look around, there's two more talking to a man. They're everywhere. And they're his sort of imagined, either lost or still to be found love, Anne. He seemed to give this girl a sort of generic name. I haven't really counted them, but there's quite a few here. There's one on the left, and then when you start to look, there are more. There's probably about 10 or 15 of them. Although they're all slightly different, they are meant to be the same person. And Larry was always too shy to engage anybody in conversation. So he would only really begin to talk to people in the office where he worked or the art school where he studied after perhaps not quite months, but even years of seeing them. And this is some way of him recording quite what he's thinking about. So if we go on to the next one, we'll see, this is Anne. Whether actually she existed or not is not very clear, but there was a series of girls that Lowry knew throughout his life, from his art student days, the beginning of the 20th century, through to the 1930s. There's an Anne working in his Manchester office, and then two other Annes, Carol Anne, who inherited his estate, and prior to that, just Anne. And they're sort of idealized. You can see we're looking at the front here, but at the back she has the long plait with a bow. And for a man who Larry never married, and it's not really sure whether he really had a relationship with anybody particularly, but because you're a rent collector, you're an unwelcome visitor. Let's put it like that. It's not that people hate you, but they've just wished you hadn't come to collect the rent. So he was always looking in. He's an observer looking in. So his portraits, things like this, are incredibly intense. The eyes are huge. They're sort of over large, which somehow accentuates the gaze. And this was a picture which stayed with Lowry throughout his life. And then when he died, was passed to his niece or adopted niece, Carol Anne. You might imagine how, and Carol Anne's name was also Lowry, but they were not related. So in the end, Lowry paid for her school fees, paid for her to go to art school, and kept a relationship or an association with her till the end of his life. And Carol died a couple of years ago, having moved out to New Zealand. And perhaps it always meant to be that Carol didn't have a father. He was an absent father. So Lowry fulfilled the role in a sort of pretend uncle fashion, I think. Steve, let's move on to the next one. For those of us who are more familiar with Lowry's industrial scene, then this is a view of Glasgow docks. And he's using the ships here to create a level of industrial interest here. You've got the usual figures in the foreground, and the ships create or take the place of the buildings. Sorry, I'm just catching up on my notes here. And a picture like this is going to be interesting. It's not quite as valuable as the open seascapes we were talking about, but this is again 20 by 24 inches. It's an oil on canvas from the mid to late 1930s, and would probably make in between 2 and 3 £100,000. And so something like this, I guess, for insurance would be significantly more, as they're quite hard to get a hold of and quite rare. So he's combining the sea here with the ships and the dockyard and the figures. And let's move on now to our next image. Lowry worked in all sorts of materials, and this is a very rare watercolor, which it's hard for you to see. But is it possible, Steve, just to focus in on the bottom left where the signature is? A bit more. Yeah, so here we see the famous Ellis Lowry signature, most copied and the most faked artist probably around, other than Picasso and a few others. But here you have a very clear signature. This is a work from 1956, which he only finished in 1959, which is most unusual. It says Ellis Lowry, 1956, finished 1959. I'm guessing that's because he was working on it at a place that he had visited, and he wasn't going back there as often as he would like. But believe it or not, a watercolor is quite a rare thing.
Jonathan,
yeah,
did Lowry have a preferred material that he liked to work with, or?
Yes, he did. Good question. Pencil. He absolutely loved drawing in pencil. There's one or two that we'll see as we go along, for two reasons. One, that he liked doing it, and two, for some reason, it was like therapy.
Right.
So he would, if he made an oil painting, he'd also generally make a drawing of the same subject. So you'll see the two things, one in pencil, one in oil. And I don't know whether any of you remember, if you take a soft pencil and a piece of paper and you keep going up and down the same area, it ends up being shiny. So you have like a sheen to it. That was Lowry's absolute favorite thing. So if you look at a Lowry drawing, the corner of buildings and the surroundings of windows and things that stick up like chimneys, he loved doing those, and they are quite shiny. It's like a graphite sheen on them. But certainly pencil is there, and he loved. Although he didn't really do sketches for his work, he would take a sketchbook with him and a pencil in case he saw anything interesting.
Thank you.
No, not at all. So let's move on, Steve. Let's see what's coming up next. So here's a pencil drawing, as it like magic. Here is a pencil drawing. I'm just going to catch up on my notes here. And this is, I mean, it's called Figures Beside a Harbour, and that's pretty much what it is. I'm not absolutely sure where it is, but there's this drawing is quite an expensive one, and it came from Lowry's estate. When Lowry died, he just died. He'd moved to Mottram in Longdendale, which is in Greater Manchester, in 1939, and died in 1976. He never ever got round to registering with the local GP. So the first time he was ill was when he was taken to hospital and eventually died. So he was quite a healthy soul. But in this drawing, you see almost every single Lowry signature element. In the foreground, you've got the figures. And Steve, we got two dogs there looking right at the bottom.
Yeah.
Yeah, got two dogs, lots of groups of people. And again, going back to Abby's question, the figures that you see will have been worked on with quite a lot of graphite and soft pencils as they come up. If we come out again, just looking at the sky this time, Steve, you will see something which really only appears in the 50s and 60s. Behind the church, there are three things sticking up. I have absolutely no idea what they are, and they don't make any sense, but they do start to appear. They're not really objects of anything. They're not chimneys. They're not part of anything. They're just his imagination as to what you might find on the seaside, and we'll see later on more of these. But they're just something in the landscape. I guess it gives it some distance. But here, this is quite an unusual thing. And drawings generally, if you go back 20 or 30 years, were quite interesting, but probably would seldom make more than £2,000 or £3,000, £4,000, something like this. But as the oil paintings got more and more and more expensive, into the millions, going to the match made £6.5 million a couple of years ago, and I helped the Lowry with various elements of acquiring that. These drawings inevitably, particularly fine finished ones like this, began to make more and more, and this particular one sold in July 2020, so what, 4 years ago, for just over £50,000, which is a lot for a pencil drawing by anybody, but for Lowry, it's what you're seeing as the market develops.
Is that market just in the UK, or is there any interest internationally in his work?
Yeah, good question. He is very, very English in his taste. You know, you look at artists and you can see that, or even artists say that they're influenced by each other. Picasso would say he was influenced by Gauguin, and so it goes on. But Lowry's style is unique to him. He's an English artist who he owes nothing to anyone. So you can't look at a Lowry and say it looks like this, because they just look like Lowry. And so what's happened over the years is that the interest in collecting Lowry is British. In fact, I would say almost certainly English. I remember once pitching, as in the commercial word you had to do for the sale of a particular collection, and I worked for Christie's, and our arch nemesis was Sotheby's, effectively a duopoly. So we were always battling each other for slices of significant business. And I thought that we at Christie's at the time had got the strength in the market and the broadest buyer profile, which indeed turned out to be the case. But then I was struck by something as I was trying to look at the statistics and say, and play to our strengths, that the regular buyers, owners, collectors of L.S. Lowry, who includes many famous people, were all English. They all had English postcodes. There wasn't a Welsh postcode, there wasn't a Scottish postcode. They were all English postcodes. And yes, there were some buyers overseas, one in Australia and one in America. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And there had recently been an exhibition in China. But then I looked at those overseas buyers, and they were all expat. So yes, they were living in Australia, but they were British. They were living in America, but they were British. So he is a peculiarly English taste. And the people who bought them at the time, people like Tommy Steele, Frederick Forsyth, I sold his collection. And in the 50s, particularly 50s and 60s, the exhibitions of Lowry's work at the Lefebvre Gallery in central London were a complete sellout. So unless you got there early, then you'd miss out.
Did Lowry receive much recognition whilst he was living for his work, or?
Yes, no, that's a very good question. Yes and no. He was his own worst enemy in a funny way. There's something I can just run through now. So to begin with, no. I would say if we say he begins painting in 1920, and by 1950 he's still seen as, the problem was he was painting the industrial scene, and it looked a bit grimy and dirty, and people didn't want to be reminded of that, so they were a bit dismissive. And then suddenly, like an explosion, he retires in 1952, does some more painting and exhibiting in London, and suddenly everybody wants to know him. So he went from being he wasn't in the least bit famous, and he wasn't appreciated. No, he's appreciated much, much, much more now than he ever was at that point. But he did achieve fame. He turned down a knighthood, Companion of Honor, an MBE, various things. So that probably didn't help to be recognized and then turn them all down. But he did become a member of the Royal Academy. And he agreed to go to the Manchester Man of the Year dinner in 1965, where he was feted for his contribution. And so there was things that he was quite selective about what he accepted. So, you know, if he had a PR person, he'd have done a lot better. But in his own head, I think he thought this, you know, he didn't want to be a knight because it might be a lot of hassle. But I think the short answer to the question is no, he wasn't really appreciated until quite late on in his life. And then there's one or two pictures which show that there's two pictures which are really quite weird shape, 15, 20 inches high by about 3 or 4 across, just showing a single lighthouse type construction out in the sea. I think at one point he went from being ignored to besieged. Everybody wanted to know him, so he felt a bit sort of hemmed in. There didn't seem to be a middle period. He was either not appreciated and then over appreciated with nothing in the middle. Right, let's move on, Steve. What's next? Now, this is perhaps nearer to what we would all imagine as a Lowry, a picture showing lots and lots of figures, but this unusually is a seaside figure. So everybody's out on the beach. I have no idea what's going on, but it almost looks like people are on the top of a cliff and they're either climbing up or running down. But you can see the sea in the background with a little sail, which again, this is almost certainly Lytham. But what you can also see in the sky is the texture, if for want of a better word, that Lowry was able to create. I mentioned earlier that he's a much copied and faked artist, but a picture like this, which Lowry would work on for a year, maybe a bit longer, picking it up and painting more. He's adding texture to the sky, and he uses a paintbrush, a knife, and also his fingers. Every now and again, you feel like you can see a fingerprint in here. But this is extraordinary. And although people tried to imitate his work, there's absolutely no way that they would have the patience to do what he did and work on something like this for a year at a time. Right, let's move on and see what's coming up next.
You said, Jonathan, that it's much faked. Are they easy to spot, the fakes, to some of those what they're looking at?
They are for me, but at the same time, I spent a long time looking at them. But there's a curious thing about Lowry, because we all know Lowry well. There is a sort of myth that surrounds his work. So what I find is people will come and either show me a picture which is by Lowry, or more often than not isn't. When I worked at Christie's, we had a jam jar on the shelf, and it was for Lowrys that came in effectively off the street that were by Lowry. We used to put £1 in the jar every time one came in, and there were not very many pounds in the jar, because on a day-to-day basis, the vast majority, almost all of the people who had come in, had got something which they hoped was by Lowry, but wasn't. And in his lifetime, he used to carry a Polaroid of 2 or 3 fakes that he'd seen before, and in his mind he was going to seize them if he saw them again, and whatever, until someone pointed out that if he unfortunately was run down in the street and these pictures were discovered in his pocket, people might think they were his favorite ones, not ones he was going to try and take off the streets. But you go onto eBay or any of the obvious places and just type in Lowry, and you will see probably 50 or 60 Lowrys that aren't by Lowry, and possibly one that is, which is hugely overpriced and not really realistic. But I don't know. But I've met people who clearly are the proud owners of a picture that isn't by Lowry, but they're so convinced it is. There really is no persuading them otherwise. They will invent relatives that used to know Lowry. They will invent very complicated and elaborate stories about how the picture came to be in the family. And I've had people weeping while they tell the story. But it doesn't make any difference. It's still not by Lowry. But I've never really quite understood the myth behind. You don't get it with other artists, Constable or Turner. People will say, oh, that's disappointing. So I think that there is a sense of ownership or familiarity that people have with Lowry, which is unlike any other painter. Yeah, good question, Steve. I probably spend
Jonathan,
more. Yeah.
sorry, has everything been catalogued, or do you still think there are still Lowrys out there?
Yeah, that's very good. Yes, the answer is no, it hasn't been catalogued, and yes, there's always surprises at Lowry. So just when you think you've seen it all, something pops up out of the woodwork. The Lowry estate is working on a project which will hopefully end up with an online catalogue resonance. In other words, a visual record of everything that's acknowledged as being by Lowry. But I reckon he painted over 3,000 pictures and at least as many drawings, maybe more drawings. So every time you think you've seen some, or that one that we had right at the beginning, the early one of Lytham. I mean, that literally has only ever been in books. No one's ever seen it. I only saw it last year. So that makes it exciting. So there's always new and different pictures coming up. But when I think that the task of cataloguing them all is so enormous, it'll last for probably another 10 years.
Wow.
And it's been looked after by Carol Lowry's daughter and some help, art researchers in the background. So I think they will certainly get there in the end, which would be great. But almost as soon as you think you've finished, particularly with Lowry, something new will pop up. Yeah, well done, Anna. That was a very good question. That is almost, that defines Lowry.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, Steve, let's move on. So this is a picture of Deal. I don't know whether anybody lives in Kent, but this is right on the coast, not far from Dover, and a very pretty place, and the houses are very close to the beach. And
it's almost like Anna knew that was the next slide, because Anna and I think Joe are both in our Dover office.
Oh, I see. Well, you'll know Deal.
Pops a local picture.
Yeah, well, he liked going to seaside places. I mean, I made a list of places he went to. He went to Lytham, Blackpool, Fleetwood, Sunderland, South Shield, Maryport, Carlisle, Southampton, Newcastle, York. It goes on and on and on. Particularly when he retired. But he first went to Deal in the 1920s. There's a drawing that we haven't got here, but this is him going back in the 1950s. And the drawing was bought by the widow of T.S. Eliot, the poet and writer, and she bought the drawing and had hoped to buy this. And this is, I think I made a note of what this sold for. No. I think it's yes, exactly. It's relatively small. It's about 12 by 18 inches, but made just over £500,000, which puts it into context really. And I don't know quite how rare it is, but I think something like this is quite rare. And I don't know whether you can see, if you could just home in on the kids at the front, but on the edge of the sea there. Okay, that's brilliant. Stop there. What's another hallmark? We talked about the texture that Lowry you can create working on these things. If you look at the legs of the children and the faces and necks and arms, it all looks a bit white. But in fact, what he's done there is he's scraped the paint away. So what you see is white legs in a space that used to be occupied by paint. So he's painting over it, and then with a balsa wood knife, a modeling knife, he just carves out the paint, giving this sort of white textured effect, which is very clever and almost unique to Lowry. You see it with watercolor painters in the 19th century, but it's rare to find it in a 20th century artist. Okay, let's move on.
So you mentioned all those destinations that he'd been to. Did he have a favourite seaside
Oh yes,
face
yes,
to
he
paper.
did. If you imagine you're a single man traveling on a train, you don't drive, so you're reliant on taxis and lifts. Where would be the ideal place? Well, it turns out it's Berwick on Tweed. I know this because I went there to do a lecture in association with a. If anybody wants to follow up on Lowry on the Sea, there's a fabulous exhibition on at Berwick at the moment, ending on the 13th of October, called Lowry and the Sea. It's at the Maltings, and absolutely certainly Berwick was Lowry's favourite place. He went many, many times, and there's a Lowry trail in Berwick, so you can see where he painted and where he painted from, just marked out in the town as you go along in sort of information points. And what was wonderful about Berwick was that Lowry could get on the train nearby, travel to Manchester to Berwick, get off the train, cross the road and go to his hotel. So it was 20 yards from the hotel to the station and vice versa. And in Berwick, it's a fortified town on the banks of the Tweed and the North Sea. So it's not quite surrounded by water, but you've got the river and you've got the wonderful viaduct crossing the Tweed. There are so many subjects there that Lowry would spend, up to a week at a time just mooching about. Everywhere is walkable. So his favourite was Berwick, closely followed by Sunderland. For whatever reason, he loved Sunderland, because of the hotel he went to. They kept a room for him looking out over the sea, so he could set up his studio in his room in Sunderland, the Seaburn Hotel, and they made a huge fuss of him, and he loved that. And everywhere again in Seaburn Hotel was walkable. Lowry, these days it would be, if you met someone who only ate the same meal and sat in the same place, that would be more defined. But certainly Seaburn Hotel was very, very much his second favourite, and just as easy, just a bit further down the coast, and you're there near Sunderland, which still has a very nice collection of Lowrys to see.
Jonathan?
Yeah.
Did Lowry ever travel abroad and
Yeah,
paint, or is it
well,
mainly just?
That's an extremely good question. Thank you. Steve, can we go on to the next image and I'll answer that question? So yes, the question is, technically, he never went abroad, but despite his love of the sea, he liked looking at it, but not going on it, if you see what I mean. But he did go to Ireland. That's absolutely the only place he went that you'd class as abroad. He had some very nice friends, an artist called Pat Cook and her husband. And this is a drawing of Drogheda. It's from 1970. And I think he probably only went to Ireland because Pat and her husband probably persuaded him to go. So he would have almost certainly gone on the ferry from Liverpool. I suspect it would be the nearest one. But that was it. You'd have thought he would be a regular traveller abroad, but he did exhibit in Paris from 1920 to 1930. Weirdly, before he ever exhibited in London, which didn't happen until just before the outbreak of the Second World War. So if you'd have been a Parisian visitor to the effectively the Paris Open Exhibition, which happened every year, so it's the equivalent of the Royal Academy, then you'd have seen work by Lowry. I think that came about because his teacher was French, a chap called Adolphe Valette, and perhaps had found a way out. But there is no evidence of Lowry actually ever going to France to look at his own pictures. But this is from 1970. I've not been to Drogheda. I think if we just see the next one, Steve. This is also Drogheda, but a watercolour, very, very rare piece. These are all in museums, so I can't really tell you the value, but they're probably quite significant. Something like this would be between 80 and 100,000 pounds, and the drawing we just looked at is got probably about 30 to 40,000 pounds. Let's see now. Well, let's go on to next one. So this is the first one we've had so far, which literally is pure sea and sky. So we've got the sand in the foreground, we've got the sea like a sort of meat in a piece, in a sandwich in the middle, and then the sky beyond. And these are quite rare. That I think I've counted possibly 20 or 30 of them. And he talks about them a bit. I'll just read you a little bit about when he's talking to a friend of his, Monty Bloom, who was a property developer and businessman in the 1950s, and a friend of Lowry. And Lowry confessed to his friend and avid Lowry collector Monty Bloom that he was often tempted to put a mill chimney in the middle of an otherwise empty seascape such as this. However, he thought if he did do this, they would probably accuse him of being a surrealist and call him Salvador Lowry rather than Salvador Dali. That was as near as Lowry ever got to a joke, I think. But these are extraordinary things, and there isn't, I mean, in the same way that Lowry's work is unique, these are unique to him. You could say they're expressionist or they're abstract, but they're nothing like that, and they're quite exceptional. There's another one next, if we can move on, Steve. And he didn't just confine himself to oil paint. Here you can see this is a trawler out at sea, and this is probably almost certainly something he saw when he was staying not at Berwick but at Sunderland, which much more, there were many more industrial and commercial boats here. But you can just see where we talked about his use of and love of pencil. This is a pencil drawing, but the body of the boat is created again from pencil, and with Lowry just moving his pencil over and over and over and over again to produce that very dense surface you see on the boat. And the waves are just one stroke of a soft pencil. Very elegant and very difficult to do without it making it look like a mess. So you see the tips of the waves are all little strong, thick pencil lines. Very special thing. Lowry was a great one. He didn't have a camera, so anything he saw he drew. But there is a photograph of this ship which I found in online, and it's a tanker that was beached effectively in between. Well, the nearest town would be Berwick, and it stayed there for ages because it was too difficult and too expensive to move. So he went back and drew it time and time again. So you've got the very Lowry-like figures in the foreground, but again, this time a feature in the landscape. He was always looking for new subject matter. So I think this is called the beached boat or something like that. Yes, beach boat. It's about 1963. But very nice thing, and you can see the kids playing in the boats in the foreground. Very nice. And next one, please, Steve. This is a combination of, it's called a seascape, and as you can see, it's more of an inlet or an estuary than anything else, but very typical. From 1962, so a year before the one we've just been looking at, but it combines the elements of the empty landscape with no features, and these, I don't know what really they are. I don't imagine they actually existed. They're a combination of a seascape with these elements being thrown in, but they start to appear in the 60s and again through to the 70s. Now that is more or less it in terms of Lowry in the sea. And just to end with, I've thrown something in which is quite a nice little takeaway. This is a picture of a picture. I couldn't get a colour shot of it, but it is not painted in black and white. It is an oil painting. It's about 30 inches by 24. It's part of an exhibition that Lowry was preparing in the 1950s, late 50s, early 60s in the Lefebvre Gallery. And as usual, he would come down to London to attend the opening. And as the staff were hanging the pictures, one of them said to Lowry, excuse me, Mr. Lowry, I think there may be something wrong with this. And he started to look at it. Now, I'll offer you the challenge of working out what's wrong with it as you see it here, and I promise I'll give you the answer.
I can see it, but I'm not going to say.
Okay, well let's move on to the next slide, and that hopefully should resolve it. It's a close-up shot.
And unless anyone else can see, can anyone see it?
Anybody else see what's wrong with this picture?
It seems too soon to give the answer away.
Yeah. The figures are all right. The steps all work. The building they're all stepping up to a building. What you're looking for is in the foreground. I've got 2 dogs. How many children? 3 children, 4 children, 5, 6, 7 children. No, let's go to the next one, Steve. Oh, someone's got it.
Yeah, dog's got 5 legs.
That's it. Absolutely. We'll show you the next slide where it's a bit easier to see. There you go. So that's a close-up of the bottom, and sure enough, that dog in the middle has got 5 legs. So Lowry looked at it for a long time and said, well, if it's got 5 legs and I only paint what I see, that's how many legs it had. That was his answer. Oh dear. So I don't know if you watch him. If any of you are interested and want to follow up, if you go onto YouTube, there's a nice black and white TV clip from 1957. I think it's called. It's called, I don't know, Looking at Lowry, something like that. It's easy enough to Google it on YouTube, and it's about 10 minutes. But you see him working, and it's amazing watching him create dogs, which he does literally with 1 stroke. So 1 stroke for the tail, one for a complete stroke, no hesitation, no nothing. The ears, and so you've got a dog literally in seconds. It's quite extraordinary to watch. And I think, as far as I know, this is the only picture with a dog with 5 legs that Lowry ever painted. That's just the takeaway. Nothing to do with Lowry and the sea, but just to show that. And I'm pretty sure that Lowry had just accidentally put in the extra leg, but he does it so quickly you can sort of see why. I think that's it from me, Steve. I don't know whether there are any more questions. I'm happy to answer any.
Any questions?
I have another one, sorry.
No, no problem.
It's quite interesting for me because I do have a client who has a Lowry, but she said it's quite a morbid picture. Did he, I mean, you can tell there's use of colour in some and a lot of sort of black and white greys. Did he have, like, do we know of any periods where he's just doing really miserable stuff, or was it just anything and everything at any time?
No, he went through a miserable period when his mother died. His father died in the early 30s. Then he effectively nursed his mother till she died in 19. She basically took to her bed when her husband died, and so in 1939 she died. And he painted some. I would say the pictures are not miserable, but they were tormented is perhaps the best way of describing them. So anguish is another one. So they're mostly all, I think they're all portraits. And there's a picture called Father and Two Sons, which is a father flanked by 2 sons either side, which was bought. I remember it originally had belonged to Monty Bloom, and then when he died, it was sold to a family in West Sussex, and then went to Manchester. It was owned by a guy called Selwyn Demi, who, I don't know whether, Raquel, you've ever heard of Demi. There are bookmakers in, lots of people who are bookmakers owned Lowry, but Gus Demi was Selwyn's father and had betting shops in
Sounds
Manchester.
like, I was just going to say, sounds like I remember a betting shop called Gus Demi. Yeah,
that's Selwyn's dad. Yeah,
Right.
and Selwyn collected Lowry and lived just as you come out of Wilmslow on the road out, as it were. And he bought the picture. I can't remember what he paid for it, but it's quite big. It's about 40 by 60 inches, and it is terrifying. The previous owner's children, I remember the owner telling me, said that they'd rather wet themselves than pass it on the landing. Hence their reason for getting rid of it. Selwyn had it for about a week before he gave up and sold it to his over-the-road neighbour Frank Cohen, who has He's like he's the Saatchi of the North, Frank, and Frank is not frightened of anything. So he bought the picture and sold it again about 3 or 4 years ago. But you're quite right that he did. Anna, they're more sort of, I don't know what, traumatized than morbid. But you could say that the palace is different. And then somehow he's still working full time. Bear in mind, it's not until 1952 he retires. And when he gets to the 1952, he does seem to sort of get over the death of his mother, but he finds it very difficult. But of course, she tormented him at the same time. So it's no matter what he did, it was never good enough. But at the same time, when she'd gone, he missed her terribly. So it's a story in itself.
Can I ask if he had another loss around the 1950s? Because he's done some there, like the funeral party, and there's another one that's quite awful looking, if I'm honest.
But he was perfectly capable of in the early 20s, he would see what was going on as he's walking around collecting rent. So he would do. Monty Bloom also owned a picture called the Funeral, and so he would depict miserable scenes, and they would be quite dark and be using a sort of gloomy palette. But he himself was all right, if you know what I mean. It wasn't until the mother died that he himself became miserable, and they looked traumatized. So there are sort of dark pictures, and that's what people knew him for, which made life a bit difficult. And people were a bit dismissive and said that they didn't want to be reminded of gloomy Manchester.
Thank you.